Well, hello everyone. Welcome to our next lecture series. This is the week where we talk about European colonialism in a more modern context. So we're looking at the middle of the 1800s going into the late 1800s. The United States is going to get involved in this era of time of going forth to create colonies. That's not something that the United States was really interested in earlier. It was more about expansion across the continent of North America, sea to shining sea and manifest destiny. But then there becomes a point as we get to the late 1800s where the United States, like Europe has before, is going to be looking for markets, places to get resources from and to sell things to. And so the United States joins in the big game. So I'm going to talk about Africa first because this is where it really gets going for Europe, and then we'll get into the rest of it, which starts to include the United States as well. So the African trade is something that the Ottoman Empire used. It's something that the early Roman Empire used as well, all the way through its existence, because there's always been a lot of resources and markets in Africa. And so these resources are extremely important to Europe. And Europe, becoming a more and more industrializing nation, is going to need more and more of all of these products. Everything from brass and copper all the way down to textiles and sugar and slaves, right? These are all parts of what Europe needs for it to be able to manufacture things. And then Europe can sell their products back to Africa and other places as well. And so when we look at the European trade with Africa, we look at this, right? The major regions of major trade and colonies even. So we've got France, we've got Spain when we get to the pre-19th century, so the 1700s, Britain, and we've got Spain taking all of this, as you already know, for a while. We've got Portugal over here in Brazil and parts of Africa. We've got England all over the place, eventually all the way up here in Canada, and of course the 13 American colonies, which will get their independence finally. We've got all three of these major nations, Britain, France, and Spain, over here in India from time to time. Eventually the Dutch will get involved in this as well. And then, of course, over here, the Philippines. Why do you need the Philippines? Well, they're really important as a staging ground for further trade into Asia. And so it's kind of a gateway to Asia. Eventually, Spain and Portugal and others will even get over here into Japan. And that's its own interesting story. But for now, we're really focusing on the fact that eventually Africa is going to be a major focal point. And that major focal point happens to be right about the time that the United States is starting to expand across this continent here, and Spain is losing through rebellions of the people that live there. Spain is losing control of their colonies as we get into the early to mid 1800s. And then the United States passes that Monroe Doctrine that Britain and the United States will team up on so that they force Europe to not be able to go here. So these countries become the sphere of influence of the United States and of Canada, really. And the rest of Europe is kind of in need of more resources. And so finally, they have to figure out where to go for those resources if they can't go here and take over where Spain is leaving. And that means Africa. That just becomes the most obvious place to go. So what is it that these guys want? The Europeans, I mean. They need sources for raw materials. They need markets for their finished goods. It all comes around the fact that as we get to the middle of the 1800s, Europeans are industrializing, starting with Britain, as you already know, and then moving into the other nations as well. Nationalism. The idea of nationalism is that you can take your culture and spread it around to other people. And basically, you are saying, if you're a nationalist, you believe that you are the only best kind of people that exist. You are really into the idea that your culture, your people, your shared heritage is the most important and best, right? So when you take these European nationalists of the period of imperialism, this period of the 1800s of going in to colonize Africa, you've got a number of European nations that have really echo chambered themselves into believing that they are the only and the best. So, I mean, if you talk to a British colonizer from the middle of the 1800s, they would talk about themselves like they were God's gift to humanity and to the planet. And that would be the same if you talk to anybody else, the Belgians, the French, the Germans. You talk to anybody, and they basically believe they were God's gift to the planet. And the Americans will start doing this pretty soon as well. Missionary activity, part of nationalism for the Europeans, as well as part of going to get resources, was also to send the missionaries. And the missionaries would Christianize people that came under control of various European nations. That was part of their drive. Obviously, the need for military and naval bases. Why do you need that? Well, if you're going to control this kind of territory, if you're going to have colonies all over, you need to have militaries around to protect your colonies from other Europeans, as well as to protect from native cultures that might rise up in rebellion. So you need that, right? You need these bases. You need places to put people that you don't need anymore, prisoners or excess populations. And so the British will become big at doing this, as will the Belgians and the French, which is to take people you don't need that are in your country, that are overpopulating your country, and you send them away. You send them to colonies to make colonies, or if they're criminals, to prison camps in colonies to do the hard labor. But this was something that the Europeans were doing, which was just sending people away. Okay, Australia becomes a place for that, right? Socio and economic opportunities. The more colonies you have, the more places that you have to get resources from, to trade with. People that may not be able to buy land in your country can go to this colony and be able to buy land cheaply there. That's part of the story for how the American colonies became so quickly spread, because of England not having really good opportunities for the middle and poorer classes. But if the middle or poorer classes went to the American colonies, there were all kinds of opportunities for them, right? So this is a reason to have colonies, for your people that may not have opportunities at home to go abroad into a colony that your country runs. And they might have opportunities there. Humanitarian reasons. From time to time, the Europeans will actually be going into foreign nations to conquer them so that they could help them. I know that doesn't sound right, and it's not really, but I will talk to you about that when we get to the white man's burden part of this lecture. Okay, but the humanitarian reasons are, we need to lift people out of their savagery and make them more like us. Right? That's kind of the idea there. And then finally, you have all of this that leads really into everything else, which is the European racism, this viewpoint that your country and your kind of people are better than other kind of peoples. And when you blend that with social Darwinism, which is that idea of the survival of the fittest that Darwin never said, but the business and political community did, right? And of course, this philosophy of the white man's burden, you put this together and you've got great motivations for colonizing, not just for money, but also for the spread of your idiom around the world. We'll talk more about this, right? Now, there's a bunch of names that are really famous in this period. These are people that might be referred to if you go to Disneyland and you get onto the Jungle Cruise. This is the era we're talking about. The Jungle Cruise is sort of a parody of the ideas of Europeans going into Africa. And so you have guys like Sir Stanley and David Livingstone. That's that guy that went to explore, disappeared, and Sir Henry Morton Stanley goes to find him and finally does. And the famous British phrase, Dr. Livingstone, I presume, right? After searching for years to find this guy who was lost in the middle of Africa somewhere. Anyway, when we get to 1890, this is the year where things really start to change. In 1890 is when a number of European nations were ready to go into Africa. The problem is that these European national nations, who are developing large militaries for their colonies, including England, Germany exists now, by the way, and we'll get more into the development of Germany and Italy and those states after this lecture. Well, Africa in 1890 is basically ripe for the taking. The Ottoman Empire is very weak at this point. They're not going to be able to kind of hold on to their territory here very easily or to assist these guys. There's lots of different states here that have grown over time with trade from the Europeans. But the Europeans have not really, except for the Cape Colony with the Dutch, the Europeans have not really gone inland here. They've gone to explore, a few people have, but no major armed force has gone in to actually take Africa. Now, in 1890, the problem with doing this is that if all these major industrialized nations of Europe want to all go in at the same time to get those resources, what's going to happen is they're going to end up at war with each other. And what we know is World War I, which isn't supposed to start for 30 years, might actually start in the 1890s. So the deal is that Europe is going to do something very interesting. The leaders of these Western European nations are going to meet. And when they meet, they're going to discuss how to do this. This is what Africa looks like on the eve of World War I, 1914, and you've got a very peaceful, not for the people that live here, okay, I don't want to make that claim, but for the Europeans, the British, the French, the Germans, Italians, Portuguese, the Belgians, and the Spanish are all going to agree in 1890 to go into Africa and not fight each other for what they want. So what that means is they make a gentleman's agreement where they're going to sit down and carve up Africa and then send their armies in and colonize. And you'll see who the most powerful nations were at the time based on what they were able to negotiate for themselves before the colonizers went in. You'll notice that the British have a huge chunk of Africa and the French have a huge chunk of Africa, and then the rest of Africa is split up. The smaller chunks are split up between all the other fellows here. Okay, so you can tell that England and France, when we get to 1890, are extremely powerful, and therefore they're able to claim more of Africa before the armies go in. Here's where Belgium goes, of all places, right there in the Belgian Congo. We'll talk about this because this is really something else, the story of the Belgian Congo. So this is what's going to happen between 1890 and 1914. How does it happen? How is it so peaceful? Well, in the 1880s, there is this thing called the Berlin Conference. The Berlin Conference of 1884 and 1885 is where Europeans meet and they create the map of Africa. They create the map that's going to become this reality. Okay? So that's what's going to happen here, the Berlin Conference. And you have this interesting statement that flows along with all the nationalism and white man's burden stuff. We have this description about the Berlin Conference from a guy that was there, a politician. Here, I'm just going to read it. We have been engaged in drawing lines upon maps where no white man's foot has ever trod. We have been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where the mountains and rivers were. Meaning, of course, that all these Europeans in the 1880s are carving up Africa, and the central areas of Africa are completely unknown to them. So they're really just carving up bits and pieces of it without really knowing what's in there. So that's part of the story, right? Here's a bit about the social Darwinism thing. There was a science at the time. It had been around for a little while called phrenology. When I say science, I say that mockingly because it is nothing like a science. It is more of an ideology of racists, okay? And so there's these Greeks, or the idea that the Greek descendants, the people descended from the Greeks or from basically Europeans, have this skull shape, and for whatever reason, this skull shape has created people that are smart and intelligent and can create philosophies and European ideologies. And so this is the superior ethnographic group, right? And then you've got the people out of Africa who have this skull shape, and therefore their brains are differently shaped. You see the brains right here are differently shaped, and they're just not quite as intelligent and not able to do the same things that people born from Greek tradition have, and therefore Africans are less able to be civilized than these kind of white people here. And then you've got this this chimpanzee skull, and you've got a comparison. Look how similar the Negro skull is to the chimpanzee skull versus the chimpanzee skull to the Greek or Western European skull, right? And so people make these, in the 1800s, make this basically this racist ideology that they called a science called phrenology. And if you ever watched the movie Django Unchained, there's this scene where Leonardo DiCaprio's character, a guy named Candy, is actually talking about phrenology in this very graphic scene. And I would recommend even going to YouTube to watch it just to get an idea of it. But you can go online and type in phrenology and see the different philosophies that come from that, which are really insane. Okay, this guy here, a poet, a well-known poet named Rudyard Kipling. He is going to be somebody that you're going to get an assignment for, so don't forget to look for that. But he creates a poem that is going to be adopted by Western nations called The White Man's Burden. What is the white man's burden? The white man's burden is to basically educate or civilize people that are not white, to make Negro people, for instance, and any other group more like white people over time. How do you do that? You have to force them to do it. How do you force them to do it? Well, you need to turn them into Christians, and you need to take over their territory and have them see how you do things, right? By making them your slaves. So the white man's burden, you'll see this great image here, this image of what that means. White man's burden is through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. Pear's soap, this is an advertisement, of course, right? What is Pear's soap? Is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth as civilization advances. White amongst the cultured of all nations, it holds the highest place. It is the ideal toilet soap. What is this stuff? It's basically soap with bleach in it. And so, if you are a person in Africa in one of the colonies, and the Belgians or the English or the French or whoever, they might distribute the soap to you so that your skin over time becomes whiter. All right? Not only are you washing yourself more, but you're becoming whiter. And whiter means better, okay, to a European of the time. Crazy stuff. If you go over here, you see these political cartoons that are not meant to be jokes. These are basically meant to show what the burden of Europeans and eventually the civilized Americans are, which is to take all these other cultures. You notice how racist these are. That's on purpose. To take all these other cultures and bring them to civilization up here, to carry them up the mountain. And if you read these rocks, you really see this is an amazing political cartoon. Brutality, superstition, ignorance, vice, barbarism, oppression, slavery, everything here, right? All of these are basically these rocks that show what the Europeans and Americans feel that people of South America or Native Americans in the West, or over here if you're European, the people of Africa and India and China and Japan, that all these people are somehow uncivilized because they are not white and they are not Western. And therefore, the white man's burden is to carry these people up towards civilization by conquering them. You conquer them, maybe you can, help them out, right? That's the idea. You come over here, and one of the biggest examples of how the white man's burden is applied is in the Belgian Congo. So this is where the country of Belgium goes when they go to colonize, and the leader of Belgium at the time is King Leopold. How does King Leopold achieve this with Belgium? The Congo. Okay, so it's King Leopold II. Here's what he looks like on his money here, right? 1865 to 1909 when he actually rules. And the big reason why he's there is because rubber. There's rubber in the Congo, and so Leopold has his troops in the Congo getting people from that region to work for them as slaves. And you're going to see lots of pictures like this. It's not too different from what you might see coming out of an American slave plantation before the Civil War. And you're going to see, though, that there are about 5 to 8 million. It's hard to tell for sure. It's not like they were doing exact censuses, but 5 to 8 million people horribly disfigured. You just look carefully at the pictures and you'll start to see what I mean. Horribly disfigured by the Belgian troops. And King Leopold gave the orders for this, which is, how do you make sure people are punished? Well, you can cut pieces off of them, right? So I'm going to read this from a soldier of the time. It is blood-curdling to see them, the soldiers, returning with the hands of the slain, and to find the hands of the young children amongst the bigger ones, evidencing their bravery. The rubber from this district has cost hundreds of lives, and the scenes I have witnessed while unable to help the oppressed have been almost enough to make me wish I were dead. This rubber traffic is steeped in blood, and if the natives were to rise and sweep every white person on the upper Congo into eternity, there would be still left a fearful balance to their credit. The Belgian official here is obviously somebody feeling this in his conscience. The tortures and the mutilations of people that the Belgians under King Leopold are going to experience is just insane. This is one of those great quotes. Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not. This is an early machine gun. You're going to see versions of this used in World War One. The Maxim gun is going to help Europeans retain control of Africa, even against those that rebel. So the Yao, the Zulu, the Asante, the Shona, the Herero, the Mai Mai people, right? All these people will rebel against European imperialism in Africa, and the Europeans, of course, have superior weapons that they can wipe people out with. More political cartoons, the rubber coils, the rubber snake here of King Leopold wiping out the poor people of the Congo, right? And you start to see these coming out a little bit later. There are people in other countries who are basically looking at the stories coming out of the Congo, and the Belgian Congo is far worse than some of the worst that the other nations are already doing in Africa. There's something about Leopold and the Congo where things are just much more brutal and terrible comparatively, even in the British and the French colonies. There's this one moment where King Leopold is asked to defend himself in 1903 because of how awful his people are being, his soldiers are being to the people of the Congo. King Leopold, how about that? John Bull, the English, claimed that I tortured, robbed, and murdered more than he did. Lubert is going to reply, no, your majesty, that is impossible. And so this is almost like a joke where you have different European leaders talking whimsically about who was successfully able to kill more people and torture more people in their colonies. So Africa is not, going to grow greatly from this period. This is a period that really hurts a lot of people. The Dutch landing. Now, how about the South Africa? We're going to look at that as a focus point because that's an important colonial territory. The Dutch will go into South Africa first, and then the British will show up later when they're going in to colonize. The language spoken in South Africa is a language known as Afrikaans, and it's a bit of mixture of English and Dutch put together. So in this region, we'll talk about the different people against each other, but this is also the same region where Shaka Zulu is going to unite his people together to fight against the Dutch and later the English settlers there, and he's going to do very well. He's going to wipe out a number of soldiers come together, especially under the British Empire, and are going to put the warlike Zulus under their grip again. There is a scene of this. There's a movie called Zulu. It's obviously from the British perspective, and this scene. I'm gonna. Rorke's Drift is a little fortress that the Zulu are going to attack. And you've got British soldiers that aren't too much different from earlier periods of time where we might have studied the British soldiers. Here's the famous Boer War hat. You've also got the British with what looks like muskets. They're actually rifles now, and they're single cartridge rifles. And this is the Zulu are arrayed up here. The actual Zulu tribe is going to partake in this reenactment, by the way. The way the Zulu fought was very much ritualistic before they went into battle, hence the song. Okay, now I'm going to fast forward because the British are going to respond with their own song. There are very few British soldiers here, and they're about to go up against a ton of angry Zulu warriors who earlier in the day, the Zulu warriors actually wiped out an entire British regiment. The British will start singing themselves.
Spear points gleaming, see their warrior pennons streaming to this battlefield. Sing! Men of Palestine, stand ye steady. Come on, sing! Cannot be ever said ye. For the battle is ready, and I never
All right, now I'm going to fast forward a little bit to where they actually attack. Now, these guys don't have a Maxim gun. That's not out yet.
Stand by. Stand Sergeant.
What's useful about showing this scene is just to show how the natives are fighting in all their greater numbers, and how the British, who are about to be defeated, are able to use their particular fighting style to win. You got 3 ranks of British that are able to fire one after the other. You can see the discipline of the British in this one, which is usually going to carry them through to some kind of victory. This scene goes on and on and on, and then the Zulu actually get into the fight. And eventually, of course, the British win because, you know, this is a show made to really glorify the British at this event. Just wanted to show you that because there's a lot of stories here that even today glorify the Europeans in the African territory. It's worth knowing that, but how do the Europeans basically hold on to this territory against so many more people? And always has to do with those professional armies that these guys have been working on for so long. Okay, so let's get back to South Africa. The Boers are already there, right? These guys are already there who are fighting against the tribes that are already in South Africa. The Boer farmers are going to end up finding the British showing up. The British want to take over South Africa at some point. And so you're going to see this interesting situation occur. And so you've got the Zulu down here. Where's my mouse pointer? Well, my mouse pointer is not showing up anymore. But you've got the Zulu down here. And you've got the Boer who are going up against the Zulu in the Transvaal area. You've got the Cape Colony over here on the left, if you can see that on the map, the lower left. And so you've got these different groups, right? You've got the Zulu tribes, you've got the Boer farmers who are basically just sort of on their own, and then you've got this Cape Colony, which is where the Dutch had set up an actual colony, and then the British are going to move in and take it over at some point, right? And the reason why South Africa is so important back then and today is because of the diamond mines that are there. And even some of the diamond mines that are still there are Dutch. And so Paul Kruger is kind of a famous fellow here because he's one of the Boers who actually is fighting on the side of the Dutch. Well, anyway, Boer-British tensions. The British who have taken over Cape Town want to take over more of South Africa, and they're going up against the Boer farmers. And so in 1877, the British are going to just take over all of South Africa, that country that we now know as South Africa, and there's going to be a war between the Boer farmers and the British. In the end, you guys, the Boers actually win. And that hat that you see the British wear, that pith helmet, that's actually the hat that you also saw in the video a second ago. That is the hat of the British during this period. And we usually call that the Boer War hat because that's really when they wore that thing. And so the deal is that eventually the Transvaal, that region that's right here, that's kind of orange, the Orange Free State, is going to retain its independence from the British who continue to try to take over that territory. So the British will stay over here in Cape Colony, and the Dutch will the Dutch farmers that are still around are going to hang out up there in the Transvaal region as an independent nation for a little while. Okay. In the 1880s, gold is going to be discovered there in that region. So it's not just diamonds, it's also gold. And so the British are going to put a lot more effort into taking it all over, obviously. And so the Boer War, 1899 to 1900, the British send in a ton of troops who will conquer the Boers, who are the Dutch that are still there, and the Zulu, right, to take over, because gold and diamonds are something that the British really like. This guy here, that's Winston Churchill, you guys, who's going to become famous during World War II. It's a much older fellow, but he was a soldier in the Boer War. And Winston Churchill goes on to fight in World War I, and Winston Churchill goes on to, of course, be the Prime Minister of England during World War II. Such a famous character. It kind of shows you how close all this stuff is to each other. And so this is what you're going to end up with finally after the Boer War, is that this region right here that is all part of South Africa. Eventually, it will become independent from British rule, except that the British will still be involved. It's just that they're going to let this region rule itself. And so that's South Africa, just so you know. When we get to 1994, that's where we get to the stories of President Mandela claiming more rights for the people of African descent there in South Africa. Okay, let's get to here. China and the Boxer Rebellion. Who's going in there? What's the deal? Why does this happen at all? So the Chinese are isolationist, as it says on the slide. They like to stay away from European involvement, but the Europeans must get involved in China because that is where the people are that can make things and buy things, right? Everybody's still involved in China today. And so what it is that China has people, 435 million people that can buy European products. And so the Europeans need these guys. And so the deal is that you've got the need for Americans and Europe and other Western peoples to find a way to use China. They have to get China to buy stuff. Now, Britain and Europe are going to send industrial goods to China that China is not yet making. It's kind of funny because it's now today the exact opposite, right? They send us their industrial goods. And so Britain is going to do something interesting. Britain, in the earlier part of the 1800s, conquered India. And in India, the British are going to produce two major products. One of those is cotton, and the other is opium. And the British need somebody to sell opium to if they're going to make money on it. So the British are going to take that opium, and they're going to open up China and get the Chinese to buy the opium. So opium was recreational use in China in the 15th century, so the 1400s, and it gets more and more prominent amongst the Chinese people as the British become national drug pushers and begin sending tons of opium from India into China for a huge profit for Britain. And so in 1729, the rulers of China actually prohibit opium because opium was a huge disaster for the Chinese people. Those that are on opium tend to lose their motivation to do anything. They get sick quickly. They die young. It is a drug that could be turned into morphine and therefore help people, but it is also a drug that can kill as people get addicted to it and then overuse it. And so the British begin to smuggle opium in, even though opium has been prohibited. The British just kind of sneak it in, and people in China continue to buy it. So by 1835, 12 million people, you can see these images, are addicted to opium, and therefore they are completely useless to China as productive citizens. This is a national tragedy for China. And at some point, the government of China has to figure out how they're going to stop it. How are they going to declare a war against opium? Well, for China to do that, they have to go to war against England. And the British Empire, of course, the longer you wait, the more entrenched it gets and bigger it gets and harder to beat it gets, right? And so you're going to have this emperor here to actually start confiscating British shipments of opium. They're going to go onto British ships and into British ports that are in China, meaning British warehouses in China, and they're going to destroy a ton of opium. And just as an example, during only one seizure, this is just one seizure, of many. 20,000 chests of opium are destroyed, which was worth about $1,000 at the time. What does that mean? In 2007, that's about $300 million worth of opium is destroyed in just that one seizure, in just that one moment by this one emperor. Obviously, the British will not put up with this. They must have their cargoes, they must have their opium so that they could sell it to the Chinese. And so there's literally going to be a war that's going to happen, where the British send in their professional navy, their modern navy with steamships even, in 1839, and the British are going to wipe out a bunch of Chinese sailing vessels, meaning sailing naval and merchant vessels, to really twist the arm of the Chinese, so that the Chinese have to sue for peace. Because the British are basically punching the Chinese so that they cannot stop the drugs from coming in. So there's finally going to be a treaty. Okay, the Treaty of Nanking. China has to pay reparations because they dared to fight back against the British and destroyed so much British opium. And so the British win this fight, and they literally force China to pay for it. Okay, and the Chinese have to open all their ports to the British, which before it was only 4 ports. Now it's all their seaports are open to the British. British gains control of Hong Kong, which is an old story, which the Chinese get back in '97. And the British are going to say to the Chinese that they and other Europeans will not be able to be ruled under Chinese law in 5 major port cities. Those 5 major port cities, the Europeans can do whatever they want. So this is really a one-sided piece of imperialism that the British push in China, and it's really sad. It's a really sad thing. All this happens so that the British can force the Chinese to buy opium. So there's going to be other nations coming in to sign unfair and awful treaties. That's going to include the United States, okay? And each nation is going to get a sphere of influence, a region of China that nation gets to trade in more than other nations. So in 1899, the United States is going to become a little bit of a peacemaker for the Europeans, not for China. And the United States is going to propose the open door policy. This is something that Theodore Roosevelt is going to propose. The open door policy just means that every nation gets to have access to China for trade, as opposed to just some nations. Why is the open door policy important? It's for 2 reasons. The United States is now involved in China, and 2, it makes sure that there's not going to be a war between Europeans and the Americans over access to China. So the open door policy will open even more of Chinese ports to European and American trade. That's going to include industrial goods as well as, of course, British opium. So why does China agree to this? They don't really have a choice. The Chinese military is not even close to being a match for one, if not all of these countries. And China was able to keep from being colonized like Africa was because they did this. So you got your spheres of influence. This is what that looks like. Different nations that move in: France, Britain, Germany, Japan, and Russia. Eventually you'll see America in there as well. And of course we can't talk about all this without talking about the Boxer Rebellion. This is a group of Chinese people that form a rebellious army to fight against the European colonization, well, let's say imperialization, although it's very colonial, in China. And so this is a religious group that they call themselves the Society of Righteous and Harmonious Fists. And they believe that they have magic that can stop European bullets, basically. And so they have these rituals that they do to try to stop it's kind of the last ditch attempt. The Native Americans in America will have this happen in the late 1800s too. They have this religious revival that they think will make them impervious to American military conquest, and in the end, of course, it doesn't work. Well, what we have here is the Boxer Rebellion is going to be these people of the Society of the Righteous and Harmonious Fists trying to kick the Europeans out. And so there's going to be 8 nations including the United States, in 1901 that sent 20,000 professional soldiers in, and they put down the Boxer Rebellion and ensure that China will continue to be under the influence of Western powers. $330 million will be paid by the emperor. The interesting thing is that the Boxer Rebellion is not from the government of China. The Boxer Rebellion simply happens with the government of China basically staying out of it. They can't do anything at all at this point. And so $330 million had to be paid by the emperor of China to these Europeans to pay for their putting down the Boxer Rebellion. So there's no way for China to win here at all. It's really kind of rough. And so the Qing dynasty will collapse in 1911, and you're going to have the Republic of China begin, which is basically a puppet government of these 8 European and 1 American nations. Okay? Last topic, the Philippine-American War. The United States wants access. How does the United States get access to China? It needs the Philippines. So the United States will have a war. The war is going to be between America and Spain in 1898. Why does that war happen? Simply because of this. Spain, what was left of the Spanish Empire in 1898, owned islands in the Pacific, and the United States needed a way for steamships with trade to go from America to China. How do you do that? Well, American steamships couldn't make it all the way across the 14,000-mile expanse of the Pacific Ocean, and so we needed islands, and all those islands are owned by Spain, and we need those islands to refuel. And so in the Spanish-American War, that happens specifically so that the United States can get access to those islands in the Pacific for our ships to stop and refuel at. So once we have those, the Philippines are part of those, and the only country or territory that really fights against the United States is going to be the Philippines. Now, the Philippines were really excited to get rid of the Spanish that were there, but they really didn't want to exchange, I should say, Spanish authority with American authority, but that's exactly what's going to happen. Okay, so in 1899 to 1902, I'm just going to read through the slide. There is this fellow called Aguinaldo, Emilio Aguinaldo, who leads an independence movement, and meanwhile the United States and Spain are basically negotiating the Spanish removal of their troops from the region. Now the United States is going to have to get involved because Aguinaldo States was basically helping to free the Philippines and then was going to get rid of the Spanish for the Filipino people, and then the United States would just kind of hang out but not do anything much, that the US would just trade. And instead, of course, the United States was going to basically colonize the Philippines. Okay, so as that became clear, the Filipino people start to fight against the United States. And so there's going to be 20,000 native troops that begin to fight against the United States. And the end result is that 4,200 American troops are going to become casualties of this war with the Filipino people. And of course, 20,000 troops and 200,000 citizens in the Philippines will die. So there's not a lot of good blood between the United States and the Filipino people, even today. The only time where you really have people say, hey, the United States is great, is when we talk about World War II, because the United States, although the U.S. soldiers were not very nice to the Filipino people, but Japanese soldiers were worse. So when we get to the World War II period, Americans can act a little bit like the saviors of the Philippines. But you might notice that if you look on the news at all about the Philippines today, the Filipino people are still a protectorate of the United States. We still have control over that region, but the United States lets the Filipino people think that they're independent by giving them their own government, right? Well, the Filipino people and their government are very anti-United States. And this is because of the heritage here. The U.S. moved in, kicked out the Spanish, and then colonized through a war the Filipino people. And so we're still there. We're still in the Philippines. It's still an important sphere of influence for the United States today. Okay, let's finish up. All right. What about the Philippines? What did the Americans think of it? Americans, there were people that did not want to be involved as colonizers. The idea of the United States being a colonizer went against the grain of what Americans thought that they were. Obviously, that changes. Okay. Americans that wanted to colonize the Philippines and supported the war there, they want access to China, just like the Europeans have. Americans, if you're going to have a good industrial revolution, you got to have people to sell stuff to. And so the people that were really into the idea of American trade in China are really big into this. And the other fear is this: Germany and Japan would take the Philippines if the U.S. didn't. And that's probably true. So at some point, the Filipino people are going to be colonists of the Germans or of the Japanese. So if the U.S. goes in there, then they have an opportunity. Obviously, Japan will try to kick the U.S. out in 1940, 41 actually, right? So results of all this: 1899 to 1902, the United States has an actual invasion overseas for a colony. It is brutal. There's torture, guerrilla warfare against the U.S. troops. That's why 4,200 Americans will become casualties of this war, which is a pretty high and steep number. Okay, modern weapons versus partisan troops in the Philippines. And we have this 1907. There's this thing called the Jones Act, and the Jones Act says the Filipino people will one day get their independence, and that's going to be 1946 when that actually happens, which is after World War II. And the Filipino people do kind of have their independence, but they're still basically part of the United States sphere of influence. Okay, the United States doesn't give them full independence. What kind of colonizer would we be? What kind of superpower would we be if we let the Filipino people be completely free? I mean, come on. Anyway, so that's the deal, right? We talked a bit about Africa, China, and we talked a bit about the Philippines. Thank you, guys.